You're standing at the edge of a deep trench in the American Midwest, watching an archaeologist carefully brush away the damp, dark earth of a burial mound that has been sealed for 2,000 years. It is a quiet morning, the kind where the only sound is the scrape of a trowel against the roots of ancient oak trees. The archaeologist stops. There, resting in the soil alongside polished stones and carefully carved bones, is an object that completely shatters the accepted timeline of human history on this continent. It is a piece of iron. It is shaped, it is deliberate, and it is covered in the heavy rust of 2 millennia. But, according to every textbook ever printed, the people who built this mound, the people who lived here thousands of years before European contact, did not have iron. They did not have the blast furnaces required to melt it. They did not have the technology to extract it from the earth. And yet, the object is undeniably there. When modern laboratories finally tested the chemical signature of artifacts exactly like this one, they found something even more unsettling. The iron did not come from the earth at all. It was heavily alloyed with nickel, carrying a crystalline structure that is only forged in the vacuum of deep space. It was a meteorite. The people of the ancient Americas had been forging the remnants of shooting stars. We are faced with two distinct realities that seem impossible to reconcile. On one side, we have the rigid laws of metallurgy, which state that, without a furnace capable of reaching over 1,500 degrees Celsius, iron cannot be melted, cannot be cast, and if you simply hit a cold meteorite with a stone hammer, it will shatter into worthless dust. On the other side, we have the physical artifacts sitting in museum cases today, perfectly shaped, undeniably real, alongside the deep oral traditions of the Ojibwe and other indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes, who spoke of the star metal as a living entity that required deep listening to understand. How did a civilization without high-heat smelting technology successfully forge one of the most difficult and brittle metals known to man? And why was this incredible engineering achievement completely lost to time? To answer that, we're going to look at what the archaeological record actually proves, at the metallurgical science of what happens when iron meets fire, at the exact methods that must have been used, and at what the people of the Great Lakes remembered long before any scientist put a piece of this metal under a microscope. To understand what they achieved, you first have to understand what they did not have, and the world out of which this knowledge grew. Picture the shores of Lake Superior, stretching out like an inland ocean thousands of years before the Roman Empire was even a thought. The people who lived along these deep, cold waters, the ancestors of the Ojibwe and other Anishinaabe groups, inhabited a world that was rich, demanding, and profoundly alive. We tend to picture people of that age as simple hunter-gatherers, wandering the forests, just trying to survive. But the reality is that the indigenous people of the Great Lakes were some of the most ancient and skilled metallurgists on the planet. Long before anyone attempted to shape a fallen star, these people mastered copper. The Keweenaw Peninsula and the ancient Isle Royale are scarred with thousands of ancient pits where, dating back as far as 7,000 years ago, miners carefully extracted pure, native copper from the veins of the earth. They did not have steel picks. They did not have explosives. They used fire to heat the rock, then threw cold water on it to crack the stone, laboriously pounding out the pure red metal with heavy stone mauls. But extracting the copper was only the beginning. The real genius lay in what they did next. Copper, in its natural state, can be hammered, but if you hammer it too much, the internal crystalline structure of the metal becomes stressed. It becomes brittle. It snaps. The ancient smiths of the Great Lakes figured out a process that modern science calls annealing. They learned that if you take the stressed copper and heat it in a wood fire until it reaches a very specific temperature, a dull red glow, and then let it cool, the internal structure of the metal relaxes. The stress vanishes. You can then hammer it again, shape it further, heat it again, and hammer it again. Through this rhythm of fire and stone, they created elegant spear points, heavy axes, delicate awls, and intricately folded beads. This was a highly sophisticated, temperature-controlled discipline. It required a smith to know the fire, to read the color of the metal, and to understand exactly when to strike and when to wait. This deep, physical knowledge of metal was interwoven with their worldview. To the Ojibwe, the world is not divided simply into living things and dead matter. The universe is animate. Rocks, rivers, and certainly the rare metals pulled from the earth or dropped from the sky possess a spirit, a life force. They are not inert resources to be dominated by brute force. They are entities to be communicated with, to be respected, and to be coaxed into new forms through a relationship of mutual understanding. The oral traditions speak of the thunderbirds, the powerful spirits of the upper world, and they speak of the stars as living beings. When a star fell to Earth, leaving a heavy, pitted mass of dark metal buried in the soil, it was not just a rock. It was a visitor. It was star metal. If you enjoy stories the history books quietly skipped, the ones that show how brilliant our ancestors truly were, consider subscribing, because this channel lives on them. So we have a people with a profound spiritual reverence for the cosmos, who also possess a deeply refined practical knowledge of how to manipulate metal using nothing but fire, stone, and patience. But copper is one thing. Copper melts at just under 1100 degrees Celsius, and it softens beautifully at much lower temperatures. Iron is a completely different beast. And this is where the story stops being a legend of the Great Lakes and becomes a physical mystery that would baffle scientists for over a century. Because centuries later, and hundreds of miles to the south, a completely different group of people arrived on the archaeological stage, and what they left behind should not have been possible. Between 2,000 and 1,500 years ago, a vast and complex cultural network flourished across what is now the eastern United States. Archaeologists call them the Hopewell culture. They were centered in the river valleys of Ohio and Illinois, but their reach was continental. They built massive, precise geometric earthworks, giant octagons and perfect circles that aligned with the complex cycles of the moon. They were not an empire of conquest, but an empire of trade and shared belief. When researchers began excavating the elite burials within these Hopewell mounds in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found goods that proved the sheer scale of this network. There was obsidian from the volcanic flows of Yellowstone, grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and shimmering mica from the Appalachian Mountains. And there, resting among the remains of the most revered individuals, were the artifacts of star metal. In mounds like the Turner Group in Ohio and the Havana site in Illinois, excavators found panpipes covered in iron foil, heavy iron beads, iron celts, and chisels. Let me show you what troubles the modern mind about these finds. When 19th century scholars first looked at these objects, they simply assumed they were a mistake, or perhaps historical contamination from later European explorers. But careful stratigraphic digging proved that these objects were absolutely ancient, sealed in the earth long before any European ship crossed the Atlantic. So the pieces were sent to laboratories. Metallurgists took incredibly thin slices of the artifacts and placed them under early microscopes, and later, under advanced electron microscopes. The chemical signature was undeniable. The metal contained between 5 and 10% nickel, along with traces of cobalt. This is the exact fingerprint signature of a meteorite. Specifically, much of it matched the chemical profile of the Brenham meteorite, a massive space rock that fell in what is now Kansas. The Hopewell had traded for this star metal, bringing it thousands of miles from the impact sites back to their ceremonial centers. But having the metal is only half the problem. The real question is how they shaped it. To see what really happened, we have to look at the evidence itself, piece by piece, and understand the brutal physical reality of meteoric iron. For a long time, the official explanation from early anthropologists was dismissive. The narrative was that indigenous peoples were primitive, meaning they possessed no advanced technology. Therefore, the early scholars argued, the native smiths must have simply treated the meteorite like a piece of flint. They must have just pounded on it with a heavy rock, cold and hard, or ground it down with sandstone until it took the shape of a bead or a chisel. It was assumed to be a triumph of blind, stubborn labor over a piece of strange stone. But here is where that official assumption completely falls apart. Meteoric iron is not like normal terrestrial iron, and it is certainly not like copper. As it drifts through the freezing vacuum of space for billions of years, it cools at a rate of maybe 1 degree every million years. This impossibly slow cooling creates a unique internal structure, a beautiful geometric lattice of two different iron and nickel alloys called kamacite and taenite. You may have seen this if you have ever looked at a sliced and etched meteorite in a museum. It is called the Widmanstätten pattern. Because of this structure, meteoric iron is incredibly brittle. If you take a heavy stone maul and simply bash a piece of cold meteoric iron, the kamacite bands will shear. The metal will fracture, splinter, and eventually crumble into jagged, useless fragments. You cannot simply hammer a meteorite into a delicate sheet of foil to wrap around a musical instrument. The physics of the metal strictly forbid it. So, if cold hammering is impossible, the modern mind immediately jumps to melting. That is how we deal with iron. We build massive blast furnaces, pump in pressurized oxygen, drive the heat above 1500 degrees Celsius, melt the iron into a glowing liquid pool, and pour it into a mold. But the Hopewell and their ancestors did not have blast furnaces. They had open wood fires. A very good, well-tended open wood fire might reach 800 or 900 degrees Celsius. It is physically impossible to melt iron in a campfire. The temperatures do not even come close. So we are left with two conflicting realities. The iron cannot be hammered cold, or it shatters. The iron cannot be melted because the fires are not hot enough. The official explanation of primitive cold bashing is scientifically false. The assumption of advanced melting furnaces is archaeologically absent, yet the artifacts exist. They are perfectly shaped, carefully folded, and smoothly polished. And just when metallurgists thought they had hit a wall, one detail appeared under the lens of the electron microscope that broke the mystery wide open, and it proved that the ancient traditions were far more accurate than anyone wanted to admit. When modern material scientists finally looked closely at the microstructure of the Hopewell iron artifacts, they were looking for the Widmanstätten pattern. If the iron had been melted, that ancient cosmic pattern would have been completely erased, resetting the metal into a standard cast iron structure. But the pattern was still there. It was not erased. However, it was distorted. The straight, perfect geometric lines of the kamacite and taenite were bent, stretched, and warped. And interspersed within those warped lines were tiny, microscopic recrystallizations. This changes everything, because there is only one way that specific microscopic signature is created. It means the knowledge did not come from brute force, and it did not come from liquid melting. It came from an extraordinarily precise, tightly controlled process of hot forging and annealing, performed entirely within an open wood fire. Line it up with the copper working method we just walked through from the Great Lakes. The precision, the patience, the rhythm of fire and stone. The indigenous smiths had taken the techniques they perfected on native copper and applied them to a metal that fell from the stars. But iron is vastly less forgiving than copper. To forge a meteorite without melting it, the ancient smith had to place the raw cosmic rock into a charcoal fire and heat it. But the margin of error was terrifyingly small. If the metal is too cold, below about 400 degrees Celsius, it remains brittle and will shatter when struck. If the metal is heated too much, pushing past 900 degrees in an oxygen-rich open fire, the iron begins to heavily oxidize. It literally burns away, turning into flaky, useless scale that crumbles to rust. The smith had to find the exact, invisible window in between. They had to watch the metal in the fire until it reached a very specific, dull cherry red glow, around 700 to 800 degrees Celsius. At that exact moment, the iron softens just enough to yield. The smith would pull the glowing stone from the fire and strike it with a stone hammer. But they could only strike it a few times. As soon as the metal began to lose its dull red color, as soon as the temperature dropped back into the danger zone, they had to stop immediately. If they struck it just one time too many while it was cooling, the internal stresses would tear the meteorite apart, destroying weeks of labor and ruining a sacred object. So they would stop. They would place the iron carefully back into the coals. They would wait for the cherry red glow to return. They would pull it out, strike it 2 or 3 more times, and put it back, over and over and over again. To turn a raw meteorite into a thin sheet of iron foil, this process of heating, light tapping, and reheating would have to be repeated hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, over weeks or even months of continuous, unbroken concentration. This was not the work of a primitive wanderer banging rocks together. This was a system, a deep empirical science of materials. The Smiths possessed an intuitive, highly trained understanding of thermodynamics and metallurgy, reading the temperature of the metal solely by its color in the shifting light of a fire, feeling the tension of the alloy through the vibration in the handle of their stone hammer. And this is where the two stories finally meet, and only one of them survives what comes next. So here is what actually happened, not the dismissive official line of the early historians, and not the assumption of lost, magical high technology. The version that every piece of evidence finally points to is a testament to human brilliance. The Ojibwe elders and the indigenous traditions were right all along. When they spoke of the star metal as an animate, living thing that required respect, patience, and deep listening, they were not just telling a poetic fable. They were passing down the exact psychological and operational framework required to forge meteoric iron. Think back to the process. If you approach a meteorite with arrogance, if you try to force it, if you strike it when it is cold and rigid, it breaks. It refuses to yield. If you try to burn it into submission with too much air and heat, it turns to ash and scale. The only way to shape the star metal is to listen to it, to watch its color carefully, to strike it only when it is ready, and to have the humility to stop and let it rest in the fire the moment it begins to resist. The spiritual worldview of treating the metal as a respected partner was, in practice, the ultimate metallurgical manual. It demanded the exact level of patience and hypervigilance required to keep the iron within its narrow, workable temperature window. The legend and the laboratory report were never in conflict. They were describing the exact same process from two different languages of understanding, one born of modern material science and the other born of ancient, unbroken generational memory. What connected them was real, physical mastery. We may never recover the names of the master smiths who sat by those fires in the river valleys of Ohio, carefully coaxing the shooting stars into instruments of music and symbols of power. We cannot prove exactly how many generations it took to transition the knowledge of annealing copper into the mastery of annealing iron. But of every explanation ever offered, this is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. It proves that the people we so often picture in textbooks as existing in a primitive Stone Age had actually stepped across the threshold of ironworking. They solved a highly complex engineering problem without any of the tools we consider necessary. And they did it with such seamless skill that modern scholars spent a century refusing to believe it was possible. But the answer to how they forged it is not really where this story ends, because what it tells us about the fragility of human knowledge is the part that lingers. Why did this incredible skill vanish? If they possessed the knowledge to forge iron, why didn't it spread? Why didn't it spark an industrial revolution in the ancient Americas? The answer lies in the nature of the metal and the nature of memory. Meteoric iron is incredibly rare. It is not an ore that you can mine by the ton from the side of a mountain. It is a finite, sacred gift that falls randomly from the sky. The Hopewell Smiths were not producing iron swords for armies. They were producing singular, sacred objects for a highly specific ceremonial network. When the Hopewell interaction sphere eventually began to fade around 1500 years ago, when the vast trade networks broke down and the great ceremonial centers were slowly reclaimed by the forests, the constant supply of the rare star metal dried up. And knowledge that lives entirely in the minds and hands of people, rather than in written textbooks or mass-producing machines, is deeply fragile. If a generation of master smiths passes away without a piece of meteoritic iron to practice on, without the raw material to teach the rhythm of the cherry-red glow to their apprentices, the physical muscle memory is lost. The operational technique fades. What remains is the oral tradition, the memory that it was once done, preserved in the stories of the Ojibwe and others, stories that warned to respect the stones from the sky. We like to think that human knowledge only moves in a straight line, always forward, always building. But this ancient iron is undeniable proof that it does not. Entire bodies of science, refined over centuries of careful observation, can vanish in a single lifetime if the chain of teaching is broken. And it can happen to us today just as easily as it happened to them in the forests of the ancient Midwest. Everything you know how to do, every piece of technology you rely on, exists only because someone chose to pass the knowledge on, and someone else was in a position to learn it. The moment they stop, it is gone. These small, rusted artifacts of star metal sitting quietly in museum cases are a monument to exactly that. Think back to that piece of iron pulled from the burial mound at the start of this story, the one that defied the accepted timeline. It was never an anomaly. It was never a mistake. It was a measure of just how far ahead these ancient people really were, and a reminder of how deeply they understood the world around them. So here is my question for you. Looking at how quickly this profound metallurgical mastery was forgotten, what essential knowledge or skill do you think our modern world is quietly losing right now without us even noticing? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them, and I genuinely want to know what you think. I really do want to hear your answer to that, because the conversations that happen under these videos are half the reason I continue to make them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the deep dives into the forgotten achievements of the past that the history books quietly skipped over, then please subscribe. That is the only way you will catch the next investigation, and there are far stranger mysteries coming. If this journey kept you here all the way to the end, leaving a like genuinely helps more people find this channel. It signals that these thoughtful, detailed investigations matter. That is not a small thing. It is the whole reason independent channels like this can survive and keep digging into the archives. Thank you for staying with me, for weighing the evidence, and for keeping an open mind. Keep asking why the quiet places of history are so quiet. I will see you in the next one.